Here's a belief almost everyone holds, without ever questioning it. Insulin is the hormone that makes you fat. Cut the sugar, cut the insulin, and the fat melts away. It sounds clean, it sounds mechanical, and it's the reason insulin has become a kind of dietary villain. But the picture is missing half the story, and the half that's missing is the half that actually explains what's going on inside you right now. What blood sugar and insulin actually are. Let me start from the ground floor, because the whole thing falls apart if we skip it. Blood sugar is simply fuel dissolved in your blood. When you eat, a large share of what you eat gets broken down into a simple sugar called glucose, and that glucose is carried in your bloodstream to every cell in your body. Think of it as gasoline circulating through the fuel lines of a machine. Your cells pull it out of the blood and burn it for energy. Your brain in particular is a heavy, constant user of this fuel. So blood sugar isn't a poison that shows up when you eat dessert. It's the delivery system that keeps you alive minute to minute. Insulin is the signal that manages that delivery. It's a hormone, which just means a chemical message that your body releases into the blood to tell cells what to do. When insulin is present, it's essentially knocking on the doors of your cells and saying, "Fuel is available, open up and take it in." So far, this matches the popular story. Insulin comes out, glucose gets taken out of the blood, some of it ends up stored. Fine. But here's the part the villain story leaves out entirely. Insulin is not a one-way switch that only ever puts fuel away. Your body runs a two-directional traffic system. When blood sugar is high, one set of signals tells your body to store it and pull it out of the blood. When blood sugar is low, a different set of signals tells your body to release fuel back into the blood from storage. Insulin is the manager of the storing direction, and it works in constant tension with the opposite signals that handle the releasing direction. It's not a villain locking fuel away forever. It's one half of a controller that's always nudging your blood sugar back toward a safe middle. So in this video, I want to give you 3 things. First, how your body actually keeps blood sugar inside a narrow range, storing when it's high and releasing when it's low. Second, what insulin resistance really is, which is that same system being overwhelmed, and why it can improve rather than being a one-way road to ruin. And third, the limits of all this, meaning what the mechanism does and doesn't prove, and where the science is solid versus still being argued. Let's take them in order. How your body keeps blood sugar in range. Your body treats blood sugar the way a careful thermostat treats room temperature. There's a target range, and the system is constantly making small corrections to stay inside it. The reason it bothers is that both extremes cause real harm. If blood sugar climbs too high and stays there, the excess sugar starts to chemically damage the delicate linings of your blood vessels and nerves over time. If blood sugar drops too low, the problem is more immediate, because your brain runs almost entirely on glucose and has very little of its own storage. Let it fall far enough and you get confusion, shakiness, and eventually you lose consciousness. So the body cannot afford to let this number drift freely in either direction. That's the pressure that forces a two-sided control system to exist in the first place. Now walk through what happens after a meal. Glucose floods into your blood, the level rises, and in response your pancreas, the organ that makes insulin, releases insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin tells your cells to pull that glucose out of the blood, and the level comes back down. Here's where it's worth being precise about where that glucose actually goes, because this is exactly where the villain story gets it wrong. The glucose leaving your blood has 3 main destinations, and they are not equal in size. A large portion is burned right away by cells that need energy immediately. Another large portion is packed into short-term storage as a substance called glycogen, which is just glucose linked into chains that your body can quickly unpack later. This glycogen is held mainly in your muscles and your liver, and in a person who moves and has muscle, the muscles take up the biggest share of incoming glucose by far. Only a small amount of everyday glucose gets converted into body fat. That conversion pathway is real, but in humans eating a normal mixed diet, it's a minor route, not the main one. This matters because the popular image is that the sugar you eat marches more or less straight into your fat cells. It mostly doesn't. It mostly gets burned or parked as glycogen in muscle and liver. Now the other direction, which is the half people forget. Several hours after eating, or overnight, or during exercise, your blood sugar starts to fall as cells keep consuming fuel. If nothing corrected this, your brain would be in trouble by morning. So as blood sugar drops, insulin falls off, and opposing signals rise. These signals tell your liver to do the reverse of storage. The liver unpacks its glycogen back into glucose and releases it into the blood, topping the level back up. This is why you can sleep 8 hours without eating and wake up with perfectly normal blood sugar. Your body was quietly refilling the tank from storage the entire night. So the correct mental model is a feedback loop, not a one-way dump. High blood sugar triggers storage. Falling blood sugar triggers release. Neither signal is trying to make you fat or keep you lean. Each is just responding to a number and pushing it back toward the middle. Insulin is the storing arm of that loop. Calling it a fat villain is like blaming the off button on your thermostat for winter. When the system gets overwhelmed, insulin resistance is the phrase everyone has heard and almost no one has had explained plainly. It's not a mysterious disease that strikes. It's what happens when the storage side of that loop is pushed harder than it was built for a long time. Let me build the chain one link at a time, because each link causes the next. Start with a chronic energy surplus. That means day after day you're taking in more total energy than you burn. Not one big meal, but a sustained pattern. Remember the storage destinations from a moment ago. Your quick storage glycogen tanks in muscle and liver have a limited capacity. When you're consistently in surplus and not draining those tanks through activity, they stay full. There's nowhere to park the incoming fuel in the fast, clean way. When the quick storage stays full and surplus energy keeps arriving, the body falls back on converting and storing the excess as fat. Some of that goes into normal fat tissue, which is fine and expected. But when the surplus is large and ongoing, fat also starts accumulating in places it shouldn't sit in quantity, especially inside the liver and inside the muscle cells themselves, and in the deep fat packed around your abdominal organs. Here's the key link. Fat sitting inside liver and muscle cells physically interferes with insulin's signal. Remember, insulin works by knocking on the cell and telling it to take glucose in. When those cells are already stuffed with fat, that knock doesn't get answered properly. The cell has become, in effect, hard of hearing to insulin. That's the resistance in insulin resistance. It's not the insulin being evil. It's the cell no longer responding well to a normal amount of it. So now blood sugar doesn't come down as easily after a meal because the cells aren't opening their doors. The pancreas notices blood sugar staying high and does the only thing it can. It pushes out more insulin, shouting louder to get the same job done. For a while this works, and blood sugar stays roughly normal, but only because insulin levels are running high in the background. Push this pattern long enough and the pancreas can't keep up, blood sugar starts staying elevated, and that's the road toward type 2 diabetes. Now the part that the doom framing leaves out. This chain runs in reverse too. Suppose the chronic surplus resolves. You bring your total energy intake back in line, and you start draining those storage tanks through activity. The fat that was crammed inside the liver and muscle cells starts to get pulled out and burned. As those cells clear out, their doors start responding to insulin again. The knock gets answered, blood sugar comes down more easily, and the pancreas can dial back the amount of insulin it was frantically pumping out. In other words, insulin resistance is often not permanent damage. It's an overwhelmed system, and when you take the overwhelming load off, the system can recover a meaningful amount of its function. Especially the fat inside the liver can come down surprisingly fast when the underlying surplus is corrected. This is the hopeful half of the mechanism, and it follows directly from the same logic that got us into trouble. It's the same feedback loop running the other way. What this does and doesn't mean. I want to fence this in carefully, because a clear mechanism is very easy to over-apply, and over-applying it leads people straight into the next myth. The first boundary is the big one. The driver of this whole problem is ongoing total energy surplus, not sugar by itself. It's tempting to hear full glycogen leads to fat in the liver, leads to resistance, and conclude that carbohydrates are the enemy. But go back to the chain. What kept the tanks full and forced fat into the liver and muscle was a sustained excess of total energy coming in versus going out. You can create that surplus with any combination of foods. Fat is energy dense, alcohol carries energy, and eating too much of anything over time does it. Carbohydrate is simply the nutrient that most directly becomes blood glucose, which is why it's the one that gets blamed, but the underlying cause is the sustained surplus. Take the same person and keep them in energy balance. and their storage system has room to work normally, even with carbohydrates in the diet. The second boundary is that people differ. Two people can eat similar surpluses, and one develops insulin resistance far sooner than the other. Genetics influence where your body tends to store fat, how much your quick storage tanks hold, and how sensitive your cells stay under load. Some people are simply more prone to accumulating fat in the liver, for reasons partly written in their inheritance. So this is not a moral scoreboard, and it's not one size fits all. It's a general mechanism whose thresholds vary a lot from person to person. The third boundary is intellectual honesty about what's settled and what isn't. The core chain I described, that chronic surplus fills storage, that fat accumulating inside liver and muscle interferes with insulin signal, and that clearing that fat improves the response, is well established and not seriously disputed. What's still being worked out at the edges is the finer wiring. For instance, the exact ordering of some steps, precisely which forms of stored fat are most disruptive, and how much certain individual factors weigh against each other. So when you hear confident, sweeping claims that this one hormone or that one food single-handedly explains obesity, treat them with suspicion. The solid part is the loop and the overwhelm. The debated part is the fine detail. Keeping those separate is what lets you use this as a foundation for understanding your body, rather than as a diagnosis or a rigid rulebook. The 4 things to remember. Let me pull the whole picture into a short set of points you can actually carry with you. First, insulin runs both directions. It's not a switch that only locks fuel away. It's the storing arm of a two-way feedback loop that keeps your blood sugar in a safe range, storing when it's high, while opposite signals release fuel from storage when it's low. That's why you survive a night's sleep with steady blood sugar and no food. Second, most of the glucose you eat is not headed straight for your fat cells. The large shares get burned immediately or parked as quick storage in your muscles and liver, and only a small amount gets converted to body fat under normal conditions. The villain image of sugar marching into fat is mostly wrong. Third, insulin resistance is that system overwhelmed, not one-way destruction. A sustained energy surplus fills the storage tanks. Fat builds up inside liver and muscle. That fat muffles insulin signal, and the pancreas has to shout louder. And because it's an overwhelmed loop rather than permanent breakage, clearing the load can let it recover. Fourth, it's about total energy, with real individual variation, and it's a foundation rather than a verdict. The cause is a sustained surplus of energy overall, not carbohydrate alone. People differ genetically in how quickly this happens, and the core mechanism is solid even while the fine details are still being studied. So the next time you hear that insulin is the thing that makes you fat, you'll know it's describing one arm of a controller and calling the whole machine a villain. Understand the loop, respect the overwhelm, and remember that the same logic that explains how it breaks down also explains how it can come back. Thanks for watching. If you like health claims explained with the reasoning and the citations behind them, consider subscribing to Why-Cited. The papers are always linked below, so you can check the sources yourself. And there's plenty more here to keep exploring whenever you're curious.